The night air was cool and heavy with the lingering scent of rain, the pavement still glistening under the dim glow of the streetlights. Johnny Depp moved quietly along the sidewalk, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn leather jacket. The brim of his fedora cast a shadow over his face, and the dark-tinted sunglasses made him almost unrecognizable. It was late, the streets mostly deserted except for the occasional passing car and the distant hum of a late-night diner still serving its final customers. He enjoyed these solitary walks, blending into the world, unseen and unnoticed. A sudden noise disrupted the silence. A voice, sharp, angry, cut through the night, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy colliding with flesh. A woman's cry echoed from a nearby alley, desperate and pained. Johnny froze. The sounds continued, growing more frantic, more violent. He glanced around. A couple of people on the opposite side of the street had paused, looking toward the source of the commotion, but they quickly averted their eyes, picking up their pace. His jaw tightened. He adjusted his hat, took a breath, and stepped toward the alley. The scene before him was sickeningly familiar. A man, broad-shouldered and reeking of alcohol, loomed over a woman curled against the brick wall. Her arms were raised in defense, her trembling hands covered in fresh bruises. The man shouted something incoherent, spit flying from his mouth, his body tensed as if preparing to strike again. Johnny's steps were deliberate as he approached, his boots making a steady rhythm against the wet ground. The abuser hesitated for just a moment, sensing movement behind him, but his rage outweighed his caution. He turned, scowling at the newcomer, his breath ragged with adrenaline and whiskey. Johnny didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, tipping his head slightly, letting the weight of his presence settle over the scene. He had learned long ago that silence could be just as powerful as words. The man's eyes flickered with irritation, then confusion, then anger. Who was this stranger daring to intrude? The woman, still cowering, peered up through tear-filled eyes. Hope and disbelief flickered across her bruised face. A tense moment passed. The abuser squared his shoulders, puffing out his chest, daring Johnny to challenge him. Johnny remained calm, unwavering. The air between them thickened, heavy with unspoken threats. Then, with the arrogance of a man who had never been truly challenged, the abuser scoffed and took a step forward, fists clenched. Johnny, unflinching, shifted his weight ever so slightly. His hands remained in his pockets, his posture relaxed, but his presence carried a quiet authority, a warning beneath the stillness. He had met men like this before, men who mistook their size for power, their fists for control. He knew their type, their tells, the way their bravado cracked under the right kind of pressure. For the first time, doubt flickered across the man's face. The woman used the distraction to scramble backward, pressing herself against the wall, breathing heavily. Johnny, without breaking eye contact with her attacker, moved slightly to the side, positioning himself between them. A car passed by at the alley's entrance, its headlights sweeping momentarily across the scene. The abuser's gaze darted toward the street. Johnny tilted his head, the faintest ghost of a smirk tugging at his lips, as if daring the man to make his move. The tension in the air crackled. And then, as if realizing, for the first time in his miserable life, that he might not win this fight, the abuser hesitated. His grip loosened. His shoulders slumped, just slightly. His ego, so accustomed to unchecked dominance, was being chipped away, piece by piece. The silence stretched. And then, with a muttered curse and a venomous glare, the man turned on his heel and stalked off into the night, his anger spilling onto the pavement with each heavy step. Johnny exhaled, slow and steady. The woman let out a sob, relief and exhaustion washing over her. He crouched beside her, offering a hand, but not forcing her to take it. She hesitated, then reached for him. Her fingers trembled in his grasp. The fight was over, for now. But Johnny knew that battles like these were never truly won in a single night. Red and blue lights flickered against the wet pavement, casting eerie reflections as the wail of approaching sirens cut through the heavy silence. The woman sat on the ground, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her breath still uneven. Johnny stood nearby, his gaze shifting between her and the darkened street where the abuser had vanished. 2 police officers emerged from their squad car, their boots splashing through puddles as they approached. One of them spoke, their tone measured but firm, asking the woman if she was all right. She nodded, but there was hesitation in her expression, an unspoken plea behind her eyes. When they asked for details, she flinched, her fingers gripping her sleeves. Another officer stepped aside to speak into his radio, likely calling for backup to search for the suspect. Johnny could see it in her face, the fear of what came next. Not the bruises, not the pain, but the consequences. She wasn't afraid of her husband being punished. She was afraid of being left alone. With her voice barely steady, she began explaining, her words hurried, desperate. She told them she didn't want him arrested. She had nowhere to go. No money of her own. She depended on him, not because she wanted to, but because she had no choice. If they took him away, she wouldn't survive. The officers exchanged glances. They had heard it before. This wasn't the first woman to plead for mercy on behalf of her abuser. It wouldn't be the last. Johnny exhaled slowly, tilting his head in thought. His mind worked through the implications of what she had just revealed, the weight of her words settling over him. Then, after a brief pause, he spoke. All eyes turned to him as he made his offer. It was unconventional, unexpected. He suggested an alternative, a challenge, in a way. If the husband was truly the one holding everything together, then let him step aside for a week. Let someone else take his place and see if his absence made life impossible. The officers looked skeptical, but they weren't the ones who mattered. The woman, stunned into silence, stared at Johnny as though she had misheard him. And the husband, who had been watching from a distance, emerging from the shadows now that he sensed the threat of arrest had passed, reacted with amusement. With a scoff, he accepted. He thought Johnny was a fool. He believed no one, not some stranger off the street, could handle the pressures of his life. And just like that, the terms were set. The woman didn't argue, but she didn't welcome the idea either. She had spent so many years learning not to question things that she didn't know how to push back anymore. She merely watched, exhausted, as Johnny followed her home. The house was smaller than Johnny had expected, tucked between 2 other worn-down structures in a neighborhood that had seen better days. The paint on the siding was peeling, and the porch sagged slightly under their weight as they stepped inside. The air carried the scent of stale cigarettes and something fried earlier in the evening. A few dishes sat in the sink. The furniture was old, some of it frayed at the edges, but it was clear that the woman had done her best to keep things as presentable as possible. A young girl, no older than 7 or 8, peeked from behind the doorway of a small bedroom, her wide eyes darting between Johnny and her mother. The woman looked at her daughter, then at Johnny, uncertainty clouding her expression. She hadn't agreed to this. She hadn't invited this man into her home, into her fragile world of barely contained chaos. Yet, here he was. Johnny didn't impose. He removed his hat and sunglasses, setting them aside, making himself smaller somehow, less of an intruder. He surveyed the room, taking in the details, the little things that told a story no words could. The broken picture frame on the shelf. The pile of unpaid bills stacked neatly on the counter. The thin blankets folded at the edge of the couch, as though someone had slept there more nights than they cared to admit. The woman finally spoke, her voice tight with exhaustion. She didn't understand why he was doing this. Johnny simply shrugged, as if the answer was obvious. She didn't argue further. Maybe she was too tired. Maybe she was too used to surrendering. Either way, she turned away, disappearing into the hallway as her daughter lingered a moment longer, watching Johnny with cautious curiosity before following her mother. As the house settled into uneasy silence, Johnny glanced around once more. 1 week. That was all the time he had to prove something, though he wasn't quite sure yet if it was to the woman, to the husband, or to himself. The first morning in the house was colder than Johnny expected. Not in temperature, but in the quiet distance that filled the space. The woman moved through the house like a ghost, going through motions she had repeated so often they were second nature. She barely acknowledged Johnny's presence, as if unsure whether to treat him as a guest, an intruder, or something else entirely. Her daughter was more open in her uncertainty, watching him with silent curiosity from the safety of doorways and corners. Johnny took in the house's routine with careful observation. The fridge was mostly empty, save for a few basics. The cupboards weren't much better, some dry pasta, canned goods, a few bruised apples. There wasn't much to work with, but he had made do with less before. The woman left for work early, slipping out before the house was fully awake. She said nothing about money, nothing about what needed to be done. Johnny had the sense that she was testing him in her own way. If he truly wanted to step into this life, let him figure it out. The first challenge was breakfast. The little girl sat at the table, her small hands folded in her lap, waiting. Johnny managed to put together something simple, not fancy but filling. She ate quietly, her gaze flickering to him every so often as if still deciding whether to trust him. Cleaning came next. The house wasn't a disaster, but it carried the marks of exhaustion, the kind that settled into a home when one person was responsible for everything and had long since run out of energy to keep up. He gathered the laundry, wiped down surfaces, swept the floors. Each task revealed small details of the life that had existed before his arrival. The stains on the couch that told the story of spilled drinks and rushed meals. The cracked mirror in the hallway that hinted at an old argument, one that ended in more than just words. By midday, Johnny knew he needed to solve the bigger issue, money. There was no way to keep the house running for a week without it. He had no intention of using his own wealth, that would have defeated the purpose. Instead, he walked through the neighborhood, searching for a place that wouldn't ask too many questions about who he was or why he was there. The diner sat on the corner of a busy street, its windows fogged from the heat of the kitchen inside. It wasn't much, but it was the kind of place where people came to escape their problems for a little while, to drink coffee that was too strong and eat food that reminded them of something close to home. Johnny approached the manager, a tired-looking woman who barely glanced up from her clipboard. After a brief exchange, she handed him an apron. The job was his. The first shift was an education in humility. He took orders, wiped down tables, refilled cups before customers could ask. He worked beside teenagers saving for college, single parents pulling double shifts, older men who had been in the same job for decades. They didn't know who he was. They didn't care. To them, he was just another set of hands trying to get through the day. At the end of his shift, he pocketed the crumpled bills and loose change he had earned. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He stopped at the grocery store on the way home, picking up what he could with what little he had. The woman barely reacted when he carried the bags inside, though her daughter's eyes lit up at the sight of fresh food. He prepared dinner, something warm and familiar, and set the table. They ate in near silence, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. Not uneasy. Just, adjusting. Each day followed a similar pattern. Mornings were spent getting the girl ready for school, making sure she had everything she needed. Johnny walked her to the bus stop, noting the way she clung to the straps of her backpack like it was armor. Afternoons were spent at the diner, where he learned the unspoken rules of kitchen work, the best way to balance plates on one arm, how to tune out the constant hum of voices, when to step aside to avoid getting burned. He found himself blending in, becoming part of something he hadn't expected. Evenings were where the real lessons unfolded. The woman, still guarded, slowly began to reveal pieces of her life without meaning to. Johnny noticed the way she carefully counted out every dollar in her purse before paying for anything. He saw how she checked the mailbox with a tense expression, bracing herself for whatever bills would come. She had no access to the bank account. Her husband controlled everything, the rent, the groceries, the utilities. She was given just enough to survive but never enough to leave. It wasn't just financial dependence, it was control in its purest form. Every decision, every movement was dictated by the unspoken threat of what would happen if she stepped out of line. Meanwhile, her husband relished his so-called break. Word had spread quickly among his drinking buddies, and he spent his nights in bars, bragging about how a stranger had taken over his life for a week. He laughed at the thought of Johnny struggling to keep up, convinced that he would fail, that the house would fall apart without him there to keep it in order. But the days passed. The house stayed intact. The bills got paid. The little girl laughed, hesitant at first, then freely. And for the first time in years, the woman started to breathe. The house felt different now. The air inside, once thick with the weight of fear and resignation, carried something lighter, something new. The woman had begun to move differently, her shoulders, once hunched under an invisible burden, had straightened. She still hesitated at times, still second-guessed herself in small ways, but change was creeping in, slow and steady. Johnny watched as she began to reclaim the smallest pieces of herself. At first, it was subtle, the way she took her time drinking her morning coffee instead of rushing through it, the way she folded her daughter's clothes with care rather than mechanical routine. Then it became more pronounced. She started making decisions without waiting for permission. When Johnny suggested she apply for jobs, she hesitated, but not for long. Together, they sat at the worn kitchen table, filling out applications, listing skills she had long since forgotten she possessed. Opening a bank account was another step toward freedom. She hadn't been allowed one in her name, hadn't had direct access to money in years. Johnny accompanied her to the bank, standing back as she spoke with the teller, her voice quiet but firm. There was hesitation in her hands as she signed the papers, as if expecting someone to snatch the pen away. But no one did. When the account was officially hers, a flicker of disbelief crossed her face, quickly replaced by something else, determination. Her daughter had changed too. Without the constant presence of anger in the house, she laughed more. She spoke more. She no longer flinched when footsteps echoed down the hall. She brought home drawings from school, bright pictures of flowers and suns that she proudly taped to the refrigerator. Johnny introduced them to a local support group, knowing that survival wasn't just about breaking free, it was about staying free. The woman resisted at first, unwilling to see herself as someone in need of help. But after attending one meeting, listening to the stories of other women who had walked the same path, something in her shifted. She wasn't alone. She wasn't weak. Each day, she grew stronger. Each step she took toward independence was a quiet act of defiance against the life she had once accepted as inevitable. Then, without warning, the past stormed back into the house. The husband returned earlier than expected, his heavy footsteps echoing through the doorway. The air shifted instantly, the walls absorbing the sudden, oppressive energy. He had expected to find chaos in his absence, to find a household barely held together, proof that he was the foundation keeping everything from collapsing. Instead, he found order. The house was clean, warm. Dinner was cooking on the stove. His daughter, once afraid to make noise, sat at the table, humming softly as she colored. His wife, the woman he had spent years breaking down, was standing taller than before. Rage flickered across his face. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. She was supposed to be lost without him. She was supposed to need him. He demanded answers, his voice rising, his fists clenching. Johnny, calm and unmoving, remained where he was, watching. He had seen this reaction before, an abuser faced with the unraveling of their own power. The husband attempted to reassert himself, to force the fear back into the room. He moved toward his wife, expecting submission. But she didn't cower. For the first time, she looked him in the eye without shrinking away. Her voice was steady, unshaken. She told him she was leaving. The words hung in the air like a final blow. The husband laughed at first, dismissive, certain she was bluffing. Then he saw the bank statement on the counter. The job applications stacked beside it. The quiet confidence in her stance. The laughter died in his throat. The woman wasn't pleading anymore. She wasn't trapped anymore. She was free. The moment stretched, the house frozen in time. The husband stood rigid, his breath coming in short, angry bursts, his fists clenching and unclenching as if struggling to comprehend what had just happened. His wife, no longer cowering, met his gaze without fear. The balance of power had shifted, and he knew it. Johnny remained still, watching, prepared for the inevitable. He had seen it too many times before. Abusers didn't surrender their control easily. The husband's face twisted with rage as he realized he was no longer the one dictating the terms. He took a step forward, his muscles tensing, his presence a final attempt to dominate. But this time, the woman didn't shrink. The call to the police had already been made. The flashing lights arrived faster than before, the officers stepping onto the porch with more certainty. This time, there was no hesitation, no pleading from the woman to let him go. She didn't rush to his defense. She didn't apologize. She simply stepped aside and let justice take its course. The husband fought against the inevitable, his shouts filling the air as the officers restrained him. He tried to twist the narrative, to paint himself as the victim, but there was no audience left to believe him. His daughter clung to her mother's side, her small hands gripping tightly, her wide eyes watching but not afraid. It wasn't until the officers turned to Johnny, asking for his statement, that the pieces finally clicked into place for those watching. Someone recognized him. The sunglasses, the hat, the quiet demeanor had kept him hidden, but now, under the harsh glow of the police car's lights, his face became unmistakable. Murmurs spread among the officers, a few exchanging glances of disbelief. Johnny Depp. The woman's expression shifted, her brows drawing together in confusion, then understanding. For the first time, she looked at him not as the quiet stranger who had stepped into her life, but as the man she had seen in movies, on television, on posters that once seemed worlds away from her reality. But Johnny didn't bask in the recognition. He didn't step forward to take credit or let the moment revolve around him. Instead, he spoke with quiet certainty, shifting the attention back to the only thing that mattered. He explained, not about himself, but about what strength truly meant. It wasn't about power or control. It wasn't about making others feel small just to feel bigger. Real strength was in kindness, in respect, in standing up when it mattered. The officers nodded, understanding. The paperwork was handled quickly, and the husband, still struggling against the weight of his own consequences, was loaded into the squad car. His words carried no weight anymore. His reign over the house had ended. The woman stood in the doorway, the weight of years finally lifting off her shoulders. She wasn't lost. She wasn't afraid. A new chapter had begun. Johnny didn't linger. He never did. Before the morning sun could rise, he gathered what little he had brought with him and stepped toward the door. The woman didn't stop him. She understood now. He had never been meant to stay. As he walked down the quiet street, the world beginning to stir around him, he felt no need to look back. He didn't need to see the changes he had left behind to know they were real. Some battles weren't fought on grand stages. Some victories didn't come with applause. Sometimes, all it took was one person to remind another that they were never truly powerless. And sometimes, that was enough.